The museum at night was a different world entirely. The daytime bustle of tourists and families faded into a suffocating silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the old building. My footsteps echoed in the long, dimly lit corridors, casting shadows that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally across the cold marble floors. The wax figures, so lifelike during the day, took on a sinister air in the darkness. Their glassy eyes seemed to follow me, their frozen expressions caught somewhere between lifeless and alive. I hated working the night shift, but it was the only job I could find after things went south at the factory. The museum paid well enough, and the work wasn't hard, just a few rounds through the exhibits, checking that everything was in its place, locking up when the clock struck midnight. But something about those silent figures made my skin crawl. Each night, as I walked through the halls, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me, waiting for something. I tried to shake off the unease, convincing myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But as I turned a corner, my flashlight beam caught the figure of a man in a top hat, his hand raised as if in greeting. I paused, my heart skipping a beat. I had passed by this figure 100 times, but tonight, in the dim light, he seemed different. His face, usually a blank mask, seemed to hold a hint of a smile. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, but as I walked away, I could have sworn I heard a faint rustling behind me. I quickened my pace, eager to finish my rounds and return to the safety of the security office. But as I moved deeper into the museum, the silence grew heavier, pressing in on me from all sides. Each figure I passed seemed to loom larger, their presence more oppressive. I could feel their eyes on me, cold and unblinking, as if they were waiting for me to make a mistake. I shook my head, trying to banish the creeping dread that had settled in my chest. It was just a job, I told myself. Just another night at the museum. But as I reached the end of the hall, the feeling of being watched only grew stronger, and I couldn't help but glance back, half expecting to see one of the figures moving, slowly stepping out of the shadows. But there was nothing. Only the still, silent figures, standing exactly where they had always been. The unease that had settled in my bones the first night only grew stronger with each passing shift. The museum seemed to breathe in the darkness, the still air thick with something I couldn't quite name. My rounds became a test of nerve, every corner turned with a held breath, every shadow a potential threat. It was in those moments of silence that I started to notice the small things, the subtle shifts in the air, the barely perceptible creaks in the floorboards that shouldn't have been there. One night, as I passed through the main exhibit hall, I noticed a candle had been knocked over in the Victorian parlor display. It was nothing, just a minor detail, but the figures surrounding it seemed off. The woman in the long dress, usually posed with a serene smile, now looked as if she were scowling. The gentleman beside her, his hand once gracefully extended, now clenched into a fist. I shook my head, telling myself it was just the darkness playing tricks again, but I quickly set the candle back upright and moved on. The next night, it was something different. A chair out of place, an exhibit light flickering out just as I passed by. Each time, the changes were subtle, almost imperceptible, but they added to the gnawing sense of wrongness that clung to the museum after dark. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Dan, one of the other night guards, mentioned feeling uneasy as well. He joked about the figures coming to life when our backs were turned, but his laughter had a nervous edge to it. I tried to laugh it off with him, but deep down, the thought lodged itself in my mind like a splinter. A few days later, Sarah, who worked the earlier shift, pulled me aside. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a fear she couldn't quite hide. She swore she had seen one of the figures move, a quick, jerky motion out of the corner of her eye. When she looked back, everything was as it should be, but the sense of being watched lingered, heavy and oppressive. I wanted to dismiss it as paranoia, but the more she talked, the more I realized I had felt the same. The weight of unseen eyes, the figures that seemed just a little too real in the shadows. We both laughed it off in the end, agreeing that we were just tired, our imaginations running wild in the stillness of the night. But even as we laughed, I could see the fear in her eyes, a mirror of my own. The museum was changing in ways I couldn't explain, and with each passing night, the sense of dread only deepened. I began to dread the quiet hours before dawn, the long stretches of silence where the only sound was the soft hum of the building settling and the faint, almost imperceptible rustle of wax against wax. It was on a night much like the others, the kind where the shadows seemed thicker, the air heavier with that unspoken tension, that everything changed. I had just finished my first round, the usual unsettling encounters with the figures now a part of my nightly routine. But tonight, something was different. I noticed it first when I passed by the Egyptian exhibit. The sarcophagus, always closed and undisturbed, was slightly ajar. My breath caught in my throat as I approached it, half expecting to find it empty, but when I finally forced myself to look, the mummy was still inside, motionless, wrapped in its ancient linens. But the lid, it hadn't been like that before. I was sure of it. Trying to shake off the unease, I continued my rounds, my flashlight sweeping over the lifeless faces of the wax figures. But as I turned a corner into the Victorian section, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. Greg, the maintenance guy, was nowhere to be found. He was supposed to be repairing a faulty light in the gallery, but there was no sign of him. Just his toolbox, lying open on the floor, tools scattered around as if dropped in a hurry. I called out his name, my voice echoing in the silent halls, but there was no answer. Just the oppressive quiet, pressing in from all sides. I reached for my radio, trying to contact him, but all I got was static, a faint crackle that seemed to mock the urgency in my voice. Panic began to set in as I retraced my steps, searching every corner, every shadowed nook. But Greg was gone, vanished without a trace. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but all I could think of was the security footage. Maybe there was something there, something that would explain this eerie disappearance. I rushed to the security office, my hands shaking as I pulled up the feeds from the last hour. The cameras flickered to life, showing the empty corridors, the unmoving figures, and then I saw it. Greg was there, on the screen, standing by the Victorian exhibit, looking up at one of the figures, a butler holding a silver tray. He reached out as if to adjust something on the figure, and then the screen flickered. For a split second, it went dark, and when it came back, Greg was gone. But the butler, his position had changed. The tray he had been holding was now tilted, and his head, which had been angled downward in a subservient pose, was now turned ever so slightly, as if he were looking directly at the camera. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead as I rewound the footage, watching it over and over, trying to convince myself it was just a glitch, just a trick of the light. But no matter how many times I watched, the result was the same. Greg disappearing in a flash of darkness, and the wax figure subtly, impossibly, moving. I tore my eyes away from the screen, the reality of the situation sinking in like ice in my veins. Greg was gone. And somehow, in a way I couldn't explain, the figures were involved. I tried to call for help, but the radio was still dead, and my phone had no signal. I was alone, trapped in this silent, twisted place, with nothing but the wax figures for company. And as I sat there, in the dim light of the security office, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me, those lifeless eyes staring through the cameras, waiting for the next move. I couldn't let it go. Greg's disappearance gnawed at me, a jagged wound in my mind that refused to heal. I needed answers. With a deep breath, I steeled myself and set out to comb through the museum's darkened halls once more. This time, I was determined to find something, anything, that would explain what was happening. As I walked, the museum felt different, almost alive with a silent, malevolent energy. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind against the windows seemed amplified, as if the building itself was aware of my presence. I kept my flashlight steady, sweeping it across the figures that now felt less like exhibits and more like sentinels, watching, waiting. My search brought me to a section of the museum I rarely visited, an old wing, supposedly under renovation, where the oldest and most forgotten figures were kept. The door was slightly ajar, its hinges groaning in protest as I pushed it open. Dust filled the air, thick and suffocating as I stepped into the room. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows that made the figures seem to twitch and shift in the darkness. As I moved deeper into the room, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. These figures, They weren't part of any known exhibit. They were rougher, less polished, and their faces were eerily familiar. My hands trembled as I recognized one of the figures, an old janitor who used to work here years ago. He had disappeared without a trace, just like Greg. My breath caught in my throat as I realized that the figure's face wasn't just a good likeness. It was perfect, down to the scar above his brow that he'd gotten from a fall on the job. It wasn't just him. Each figure in this forgotten room bore the same uncanny resemblance to former staff members, people who had vanished, never to be seen again. A cold dread settled in my stomach as I stumbled upon something even more disturbing, a hidden door at the back of the room, partially obscured by a curtain. It was unlocked, the key still in the rusted lock. With a sense of foreboding, I turned the key and pushed the door open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into the darkness below. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to turn back, to leave this place and never return. But something compelled me to go on, the need for answers outweighing the fear that gripped my heart. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, the air growing colder, heavier, with each step. At the bottom, I found myself in a small, dimly lit chamber. The walls were lined with shelves, each holding rows of jars filled with a viscous, amber liquid. In the center of the room stood a single wax figure, half-formed, its features grotesque and unfinished. The air was thick with the smell of chemicals, and the floor was slick with something I couldn't quite identify. But what caught my attention was the table beside the figure. It was covered in papers, yellowed documents, sketches, and photographs. My blood ran cold as I recognized the faces in those photos. Employees who had gone missing, their images now frozen in time, forever immortalized in wax. As I sifted through the papers, I began to piece together the horrifying truth. The museum's owner, a reclusive man known for his obsession with perfection, had been using these figures as more than just exhibits. He had found a way to preserve life, to capture the essence of a person and bind it in wax, trapping them in a state of eternal, unnatural existence. And Greg had been his latest victim. I stumbled back, the weight of the discovery crashing down on me like a tidal wave. The wax figures weren't just statues. They were people, living souls trapped in a silent, nightmarish existence, their eyes forever watching, their bodies frozen in time. And now, I was the only one left who knew the truth. The only one who could stop this madness. But as I turned to leave, I felt a presence behind me, the air growing colder, the shadows closing in. I wasn't alone in the darkness. The figures, those twisted, tormented souls, they were aware of me now. And they didn't want me to leave. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled back, my mind racing with the horrifying realization of what I had uncovered. The figures in the museum, the wax statues that had unnerved me from the start, they were alive, or at least they had been. Trapped in wax, their souls bound to these twisted forms by a monstrous process I could barely comprehend. I had to get out. I had to escape this place before it claimed me too. I turned, ready to bolt up the stairs and never look back, but as I did, a low creak echoed through the chamber. The half-formed figure at the center of the room began to move, its waxy limbs jerking awkwardly, its unfinished face twisting into a grotesque parody of a human expression. It was as if it was trying to speak, to scream, but all that came out was a muffled groan, a sound that sent a shiver of pure terror down my spine. Backing away, I glanced towards the stairs, but my path was blocked. The door at the top had silently swung shut, trapping me in this nightmare. The air grew thicker, the walls seeming to close in on me, and I realized with a jolt of fear that I wasn't alone. The other figures, the ones on the shelves, in the corners, were starting to stir as well, their glassy eyes following my every move, their bodies trembling with an unnatural life. Desperation clawed at me as I searched for another way out, but the room was small, cramped, and the only exit was now sealed shut. My breath came in ragged gasps, the stench of the chemicals burning in my nostrils, and I could feel the cold, sticky floor beneath my feet, as if the very ground was trying to pull me in. And then, from the shadows, I heard a voice. A low, raspy whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was filled with a deep, ancient malice, as if it had been waiting in the dark for centuries, biding its time for the next unsuspecting victim. I spun around, searching for the source, but there was nothing, only the figures, their twisted forms now fully animate, their waxen faces contorted in expressions of agony, rage, and despair. They moved towards me, slowly at first, their limbs cracking and creaking as they stretched and twisted, breaking free from the positions they had held for so long. One by one, they surrounded me, their lifeless eyes filled with a dark intent. My heart raced as I tried to back away, but there was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. And then I saw him, the museum's owner, stepping out from the shadows, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, his hands clasped behind his back. He moved with an eerie calm, his voice smooth and cold as ice. "You've seen too much," he said, his eyes boring into mine with a look of quiet, calculated menace. "But don't worry, you'll be part of the collection soon enough." With a flick of his wrist, the figures closed in on me, their hands reaching out, cold and unyielding. I tried to fight them off, but it was like fighting against stone. Their grip was strong, merciless, pulling me towards the center of the room where the half-formed figures still twitched and shuddered. My mind screamed in terror as I felt the cold wax seeping into my skin, the room spinning around me as the darkness closed in. The last thing I saw was the owner's face, a cruel smile playing on his lips as he watched me struggle, and then everything went black. When I awoke, I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I was trapped, my body frozen in place, my vision locked in a single, unchanging perspective. I could see the room around me, the figures now back in their places, still and silent once more. And I knew, with a sickening certainty, that I was one of them now. I could feel the wax, hard and unyielding, encasing my body, my soul trapped within this lifeless shell. I was part of the museum, part of the collection, doomed to stand here for eternity, a silent witness to the horrors that would claim the next unfortunate soul who wandered too far into the dark. The darkness was all-consuming, pressing in on me from every side. Time had lost all meaning. Seconds stretched into hours, hours into days, though I could no longer be sure of anything. I was aware, fully conscious, but trapped within this waxen prison, my thoughts echoing endlessly in the silence. I could still see the room around me, though my vision was fixed in place, unable to move even an inch. The figures, my fellow prisoners, stood motionless once more, their tortured expressions frozen in time. We were all victims of this terrible fate, bound to the museum, forever part of its twisted collection. I don't know how long I stood there, watching the world from behind lifeless eyes, when the sound of footsteps echoed through the hall. The door creaked open, and a group of visitors entered the room, tourists, chattering quietly as they marveled at the exhibits. They had no idea what they were really looking at, no clue that the figures before them were once alive, once people like them. A guide led the group, her voice cheerful as she described the history of the museum, the painstaking detail that went into creating each lifelike figure. I wanted to scream, to warn them of the truth, but I couldn't. I was a statue now, just another piece of the exhibit, my voice lost forever in the wax. As the visitors moved through the room, one of them paused in front of me, a young woman with a camera in hand. She tilted her head, studying my face, a puzzled look crossing her features. Something about me had caught her attention, something she couldn't quite place. I could feel her gaze boring into me, as if she sensed that there was more to me than met the eye. But before she could linger too long, the guide called her name, and she hurried to catch up with the group. I watched her leave, my heart sinking with the knowledge that she was free, able to walk away from this nightmare while I remained behind, a silent observer of a world I could no longer touch. As the last of the visitors filed out of the room, the door creaked shut, leaving me alone once more with my thoughts. The darkness returned, heavy and oppressive, but now, it was different. There was something else in the room with me, something I could sense even if I couldn't see it. A presence, cold and malevolent, moving slowly through the shadows. I couldn't turn to look, but I could feel it drawing closer, the air growing colder with each passing second. And then I heard it, a faint whisper, like the rustle of dry leaves, brushing against the edges of my consciousness. "You're not alone." The voice was faint, distant, but it sent a shiver of fear through me nonetheless. I wasn't alone. There were others, more than just the figures I could see. Souls, trapped in the dark corners of the museum, bound to this place by the same dark magic that had ensnared me. And they were all watching, waiting, just as I was. As the hours stretched on, I realized the truth, a truth more terrifying than anything I had imagined. This wasn't just a prison for the body. It was a prison for the mind, a place where time had no meaning, where every moment of agony was drawn out into eternity. There would be no escape, no release from this waking nightmare. I was part of the museum now, and I always would be. But as despair began to take hold, a thought cut through the darkness, a glimmer of hope buried deep within my mind. I wasn't alone. There were others, just like me, and together, maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to break free. I could feel their thoughts now, brushing against mine like flickers of distant stars, faint but growing stronger. We were connected, bound by the same curse, and if we could reach out, if we could find a way to communicate, perhaps we could fight back. The thought was terrifying, but it was also the only thing that kept me sane. I wasn't just a statue, a lifeless figure to be gawked at by tourists. I was still here, still thinking, still hoping. And as the night deepened, the museum silent once more, I held on to that hope, clutching it tightly as the darkness pressed in. I wasn't alone. Not anymore. And as long as I had that, there was still a chance to escape, a chance to live again. But for now, I would wait and watch and listen. The museum wasn't finished with me yet. And in the depths of my waxen prison, I wasn't finished with it. Not by a long shot.